She's an ethnomusicologist by training. She got her PhD in anthropology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2004. And her research interests are South American indigenous cultures, ethnographic studies, and ethnomusicology. Her work in Andean Ecuador since 1995 has focused on symbolic and semiotic analytical approaches to indigenous performances. She's the author of Ritual Encounters, Otavalan Modern and Mythic Community. And her current research explores indigenous, transnational migration, diaspora, and cosmopolitanism. Please welcome.
Paper in the symposium, and then also for our comments. My paper is entitled Puna, Otavalan Transnational Migrants and the Politics of Destination. What I hope to do during this presentation, brief presentation, is just to give you an overall impression of the mobility of this ethnic community, Otavalans, and also of the diversity of their migrant experiences. And basically what this paper allowed me to do is to work through a few theoretical perspectives, thinking about the question that Dr. Corona kind of presented to us about the insights and theoretical insights that we can gain from different perspectives. And I started out with trying to avoid two pitfalls and working on one theory that's in the title, The Politics of Destination. And as I worked through it, I ended up with only one pitfall and two theories, and realized that one of the ones that I was sort of dismissing and critical of ended up being extremely productive in terms of explaining mobility, cosmopolitanism, and transnational indigeneity. So let me get right to it. According to the International Organization of Migration, there are currently over 200 million transnational migrants worldwide. The IOM suggests that international migrants could number as many as 405 million in 2050 if the current trends continue. Stephen Mertedek points out that in addition to heightened mobility in the 20th and 21st centuries, there's also been a remarkable increase in the diversity and diversification within migration flows. Indigenous transnational migrants illustrate Mertedek's point as global actors within this trend toward increasing diversity and diversification in human migration. In my research on indigenous transnational migration, diaspora, and cosmopolitanism centers on an indigenous ethnic community of Quechua speakers from northern Ecuador, known as Otavaleños or Otavalans, with whom I've worked since 1995, as Professor Corona mentioned. And Otavalans are among Ecuador's most traditional people, that they maintain their ritual traditions, their indumentarias, so their traditional dress, their language in the 21st century. They're also among the most internationally traveled and cosmopolitan populations of Latin America, with an ethnic diaspora that's conservatively estimated as 70,000 people worldwide. There's a 1993 survey of only one community, Pegucheño household, that indicates that 24% of the families in Peguche had at least one family member who had traveled abroad at least once. And later on, Lynn Meish's estimate for the beginning of the 21st century indicated that approximately 4,000 Otavalans were permanent transnational migrants, and another 6,000 traveled abroad for short-term trips. So that's 15% of the total Otavalan population. And I think that those numbers are actually conservative. And Linda D'Amico has a wonderful ethnography recently in 2011. It's called Otavalan Women, Ethnicity and Globalization. She indicates that the deepening economic crisis at the beginning of the 21st century and other factors have contributed to that percentage increasing, and that now it's actually difficult to find a family that is not affected by immigration in some way. And other communities have followed a similar trend to Peguche. Otavalans maintain patterns of repeat return migration to and from destinations throughout the Americas, Europe, Russia, places in Southeast Asia, Africa, Australia. These journeys account for proliferating Otavalan businesses overseas and at home. They also account for growing numbers of Otavalan youths that are college educated abroad, Otavalan international professionals, increasing numbers of international and interethnic marriages, new generations of Otavalan children raised entirely abroad, and pockets of distinct yet recognizably Otavalan communities throughout the world. Just as significant, mobility has led to a normalization of modern travel as part of this community's identity. Otavalan travelers often refer to themselves as purikuna, caminantes, travelers, no, viajeros. And I've also heard them jokingly refer to themselves as acapana, a whirlwind that touches down and just as suddenly is gone again. Now, it bears mentioning that geographical mobility among Otavalans is not recent. Frank Solomon has documented a thriving native economy in the northern Andes prior to the arrival of the Spanish, propelled by long-distance trade specialists known as Migalaes, actually pre-Inca also. And this institution of merchant Indians was part of a broader interzonal economic and political articulation. That entire institution was propelled by weaving, and mainly weaving at that time. So as in the past, craft production and cottage industry weaving propel Otavalan mobility today, along with music production that's supported by a marketing of their ethnic identity. This unique niche in global exchanges, along with Otavalan repeat-return migration, the legal and illegal migration paths of this mobility, differentiates indigenous migration from other sectors of national migration, alerting us to the fundamental analytical pitfall. So this is the one pitfall that I'm trying to avoid in my work, which is conflating indigenous migration with national migration statistics. The intensity of Otavalan travel also contrasts with the norm on a national level. It is truly acapana. I mean, it's like a whirlwind, people coming and going. And their desire to return to Ecuador marks a difference from other sectors who aspire to more permanent sort of migration. Many studies on Ecuadorian migration operate within the national population frameworks of analysis that unfold indigenous mobility within general patterns of Ecuadorian migration. But as Alicia Torres, who works in Flaxo, Ecuador, points out, it overlooks distinct circumstances surrounding indigenous migration that require a differentiated analysis. And I think that this call is very important. In the Otavalan case, for instance, it's not wage labor that drives international travel, although some Otavalans do participate in wage labor, but rather entrepreneurial ventures that are based on craft and music production that are tied to this marketing of ethnic identity. The call by Torres and others has prompted a growing body of ethnographic, historical, cultural geographic research that is more discerning about Ecuadorian migration and affirms indigenous people as migrants with distinct reasons and methods of travel, unique networks, and global worlds for mobility. A second tendency in terms of looking at indigenous migration has been a focus on mobility itself. So in both popular and some scholarly conceptions, the notion of indigenous people on the move remains somewhat of a novelty, as Professor Corona pointed out in his introduction. Attention to Otavalans as conspicuous actors in the 20th and 21st century global mobility at a fundamental level is important in disrupting persisting stereotypes of Andean indigenous people as agriculturalists, sedentary, locally bound, and recasting the identity of these ethnic communities as mobile, diasporic, and cosmopolitan. Nonetheless, the focus on the phenomenon of indigenous mobility itself has tended to gloss over the ways in which distinct sending and receiving communities and travel routes shape migrant experiences and opportunities. With the exception of a few studies on migration to North America and Europe, what generally appears in the literature is a tally of countries Otavalans visit, and a reference to mobility itself as evidence of indigenous transnationalism and cosmopolitanism. So for example, David Kyle reports Otavalan traveled to 23 countries. Lynn Meisch reports Otavalan traveled to 32 countries. But aside from anecdotal references, these authors provide little or no ethnographic detail on this impressive number of travel destinations. In fact, they don't even name all of them. And in a follow-up phone call to both of them, they couldn't name all of them. So initially, this was one of the pitfalls that I was thinking we need to avoid this because of the way that specific destinations shape mobility and identity. And I was critical, thinking this is sloppy work, right? of David Kyle and Lynn Meisch. But it turns out that these anecdotal references and brief listings of countries of destination mimic local experiences and discourse on travel. So it's actually much more loyal to how people actually talk about travel. And these discourses emphasize mobility. So travel and the fascination with global mobility is a topic of frequent conversation among Otavalans. The coming and going of viajeros, travelers, which sometimes involves returning home for less than a week before setting off to another destination, does highlight kinesis, momentum, speed, and it downplays specific locations. So what I originally considered to be an analytical pitfall to be avoided revealed itself as an important heuristic for understanding transnational indigeneity and indigenous cosmopolitanism from the perspective of Otavalans themselves. Something else to emphasize is that there is an Otavalan value on mobility that perhaps comes from a historical experience of lack of mobility. So one of the interviews that I did with an elderly gentleman who had experienced Otavalo in hacienda times, it sort of revealed that, for example, Hacienda Quinchuqui and Hacienda Pinzaqui, and these are all places that today are like literally 5-10 minutes away from each other, right? But these were huge haciendas that blocked access from the paths that led to the market, right? And Taita Nicolás, the person that I interviewed, he said, "Mezquinaban el camino," right? So they were stingy with the paths. So getting to Otavalo across the hacienda land was dangerous and it was difficult. Often the mayordomo, the caretaker, would catch people in transit and threaten them. He would confiscate their hats for their ponchos and force them to work for a day or two to reclaim these items and gain safe passage to Otavalo. So a distance of just a few kilometers back then took a day or even two of perilous journey through unpredictable social terrain and unexpected geographical detours. Today, Otavaleños move about with relative ease not only in their local surroundings but internationally. And this is a reflection of the changing socio-political circumstances and ethnic economic empowerment as well. So when we think about mobility, not just geographic mobility, but in other realms as well. But rather than generating like a radiating pattern, like a concentric circles in a pond that add information or knowledge about places and spaces as the map gets bigger in terms of the ethnic experience, what we see is that it generates a completely different, a completely reconfigured map in the collective imagination of where places are in the world. It's a great variance with the conventional maps, you know? And it underscores the imaginary map, underscores proximity, accessibility, but also uncertainty. So I want to tell you sort of something that happened in one of the communities that I lived in Manbaco. These events unfolded as a result of a short business trip that a friend of mine took before the Christmas season. And it captures the intensifying transnational mobility, flow, and exchange, you know, and how people conceive of it. So my friend Vicente left for Chile, but soon after his departure, we heard rumors that he had crossed over to Switzerland. Disconcerted by the news, his parents made calls to acquaintances living in Bern and Lausanne to find out if this was indeed true. During the interval of time between the beginning of the rumors and the establishment of his actual whereabouts, Vicente was suspended in space in an imaginary border zone between the neighboring cities of Santiago and Zurich. Now, Vicente's father has a 6th grade education and his mother is completely illiterate, so this may account in part for this lack of conception of world geography. Vicente had traveled previously to Germany, France, and Switzerland, and for his parents, who never ventured much farther than Imbabura province, trying to imagine where their son was this time around required a concentrated effort in explanation and imagination. Casting transnational experiences as nearby narrows the distance between viajeros and those who stay behind, and it reduces the anxiety of family members. And I'm not going to touch on, I'll just mention it, but I'm not going to go into this in this paper. But aside from narrowing the distance, I'm not talking about geographical distance only, I'm talking about experience, belonging in the community, this kind of thing as well. So the way people talk together about place and distance constitutes a strategy for understanding transnational mobility in a less threatening way. Social discourses about place among Quechua speakers revolve around conceptions of relative distance. Everywhere is chaigupi, used interchangeably with allacito nomás, just over there, or aladito nomás, aquí a la vueltita, right next door, just around the corner. The use of the diminutives in Spanish, so ito, ita suffixes, or in Quechua, which is the iku or gu suffixes, accentuate this impression of proximity and also non-threat. And of course, many times in my experience, and probably for those of you who've traveled or worked in the Andes, aquícito nomás, the local scale turned out to be like 15 kilometers up the hill. For those who don't travel abroad, the world comes to them. In addition to the approximately 145,000 tourists that visit Otavalo annually, Otavalo and Purihcuna, or viajeros, bring back impressions, experiences, souvenirs, back to the towns that they live in, and even for people who haven't traveled abroad, the names of foreign cities roll off their tongues just as easily as those of neighboring hamlets. The cosmopolitan atmosphere in the communities of Imbabura is felt and experienced through the presence of foreign languages also. So it's not uncommon to sit at a community meeting where someone has just returned from Korea and speaks nearly fluent German from a previous stay in Switzerland. So you hear a variety of different languages in this area. Cutting-edge telecommunications technology has also added to the sense of proximity and familiarity. Word often travels more quickly to the community of Iluman Bajo from Brussels than it does from Tunibamba. So Tunibamba is just across in the next canton, but this actually happens all the time, where, especially with people that are fascinated with rumors and cheesy. So there is, moreover, no inherent conflict or contradiction in the use of modern means of communication and practices such as prayer, candle burning, dream interpretation for gathering information about both people who stay and live abroad. And the compatibility of traditional and new forms of communication, as well as that of modern and Andean technologies in other realms, yield a situation in which people live or operate simultaneously in both with ease and move seamlessly between one and the other. And one of the things I want to avoid is the moving in and out of modernity that Canclini sort of presents with this oblique model. It's simultaneous, and non-contradictory. So these geographical imaginations as conceptual frames in themselves constitute an alternative to a more frightening possibility within the realm of Imbabura Quechua beliefs. A Yachak that I interviewed in the area of Otavalo told me that people in the past believed that the door to time was on Mount Imbabura. This is the mountain that towers over these communities. People who climbed the mountain would sometimes disappear through this door. Years later, after their family members had already mourned their deaths, distributed their inheritance, their spouses had remarried, they would come down from the mountain with no recollection of the time that had lapsed. Taita Alfonso, the Siachak, says that today people often think that their husbands, brothers, daughters, grandparents have traveled abroad, that they've gone to Colombia, but in actuality what has happened is that they've climbed the mountain and become lost in time. The towering presence of the Imbabura of the communities is a constant reminder of the power and the mystique of the mountain. Finding a reasonable explanation in terms of this imagined geography for foreign travel at least offers an alternative to this less appealing possibility of being swallowed up by Taita Imbabura. The more ominous interpretations of transnational migration are also present in the collective discourse and imagination of Otavalans. And it brings transnational indigeneity into the frame of reference of the mystical, the mythical, the liminal. And it raises profound questions about time and memory regarding those who travel. I've heard some tentative connections between las almas, the souls, and the migrants. I'm hesitant to go there in my ethnographic inquiry because people are hesitant to talk about it. But the migration paths of the souls and the migrants sometimes coincide. Issues of memory, what they remember, what they forget, how do we maintain them alive via memory, is important. Their absence from the community. So there's some parallels there that at some point I hope to explore a little bit further. So it becomes another framework for understanding transnational indigeneity potentially. Yeah, and then I just mentioned this tentative, right? Tentative, but I think increasingly relevant because of the more settled diaspora communities within this ethnic group. So Vicente, back to Vicente, was simply either in Switzerland or in Chile. Allacito nomás, just over there. It was indeed possible that he had changed his course and arrived from one place to the other in very little time. Aladito nomás queda. It's just right next door. Gossip among neighbors and relatives and efforts at collectively piecing together this mental map from fragments of information offered by travelers and local common sense speculation often ended up in the exclamation Taitiku, which means little father. And Taitiku in Quechua expresses pity or sympathy for someone, or kind of an open-ended, like, who knows, something like this. It was possible, they speculated, for Vicente to have crossed over to Switzerland. After all, Otavaleños travel erratically like this and have connections all over the world that facilitate visa transactions and other paperwork. Relatively speaking, it couldn't be that far away. Taitiku, Maipipurishkacha. And donde mismo anda? Where could he? Who knows where he could be? So no matter how people tried to reason through this puzzling situation, in the end, like Werner Heisenberg's quantum particles, whose momentum and position cannot simultaneously be ascertained with absolute certainty, precision, poor Vicente was temporarily lost in a blur of mobility in one of the wrinkles of an unfolding, collapsing geography. A whole generation of Otavaleños currently finds itself in a predicament similar to Vicente's. As the social landscape fragments and shifts tectonically under the pressure of new means of travel and the flow of people, goods, information, capital, new spaces of identity and social interaction emerge. The emphasis on mobility, both among ethnographers working in the Otavalo area and among Otavalans themselves, yields theoretical insight into the native perspectives on transnationalism and identity. And here's my assertion about this. Otavalan global mobility may be deeply tied to long-established Otavalan conceptions of cosmopolitanism as something integral to indigenous identity. So we have some debate going on here. Even Otavalans who do not travel think of themselves as cosmopolitan. They see themselves as participants in the world economy, knowledgeable about and open to diverse cultural ideas, and connected to select global others through a sense of shared values. This perspective situates Otavalan identities as modern and cosmopolitan, not in juxtaposition to traditional lifestyles, but as emanating from deeply held indigenous values. I propose that rather than looking at global mobility within the framework of cultural transformation, we consider Otavalan transnational experience within the framework of cultural continuity. Cosmopolitanism may be vital to understanding indigenous mobility and modernity, not as new phenomena, but as extensions of traditional indigenous beliefs and values. So the second part of my talk focuses on the politics and poetics of destination. People who I initially met in Otavalo have since traveled abroad. I have Otavalan compadres, godchildren, friends in 7 different countries, including Chile, Venezuela, Colombia, the United States, Germany, Switzerland, Spain. Is that 7? I don't know. While they initially returned to Otavalo frequently, they've become more and more settled abroad. And in fact, one of my comadres, it's been 14 years since she's returned to Otavalo. So the time, initially they returned often, and the time is expanding now. They all report very different migrant experiences. And in doing so, they signal a necessary theoretical perspective in the context of increasingly settled ethnic diaspora communities. Well, an exploration of the complex geographies of identity that emerge as people journey to and from Otavalo unfolds in the broader context of global circuits, transnational flows, and social networks. I think that Michel Abed Badam's attention to the politics and poetics of destination which emphasizes the ways by which receiving communities shape the prospects of migrants, is critical. I don't know if I'm going to make it through the whole time. Together, these two perspectives, the focus on Otavalan mobility, along with its connection to indigenous cosmopolitanism, and the politics and poetics of ethnic destination, of ethnic diaspora communities, afford a critical understanding of different qualities of experience and understanding of transnational indigeneity. By way of these theoretical approaches, we can begin to answer the relevant ethnographic and theoretical questions about this ethnic community on the move. Like, how precisely are the experiences of Otavalans defined by the countries to which they travel? What holds Otavalans together across generations and differences of experiences as a single yet diversifying ethnic community? How is indigenous migration distinct from migration of non-indigenous Latin American populations? To what degree is the Otavalan case representative of other Latin American indigenous migration experiences? What aspects of Otavalan culture and experience enable such diverse and extensive global travel among this population? So in the second part of this talk, I focus on Otavalan migration experiences in different receiving communities and the global networking paths that they enable. Ethnographic research and contrasting comparative ethnographic sites is not only conducive to adding to the list of case studies. Each destination opens distinct lines of theoretical and ethnographic inquiry and requires the application of somewhat different methods of investigation and analysis. Ethnographic work in different receiving communities highlights heterogeneity among indigenous migrant experiences themselves and the unevenness of the processes of migration and globalization. Pertaining to that point, I would say we need to think about transnational indigeneities, because of those differences not just among different populations, but within a single population. Here I'm talking about the politics of destination, but we can also talk about gender, generational differences, a variety of different factors. So let me offer a few brief examples just to underscore the point about the importance of the politics of destination. And then what I want to do is focus on one example to give you a better sense of, let me see if I'm doing okay on time, a better sense of the types of theoretical richness that emerges from each one of these sites, and also the ethnographic challenges, right, of trying to address each one of these sites. So this is sort of a collage, of the different destinations. At the end of the 20th century, the United States, Europe, and other countries in Latin America were prime destinations for Otavalan migrants. Linda D'Amico's recent ethnography on Otavalan women, ethnicity, and globalization traces Mama Rosa, who's famous, her travels in the 1940s, 50s, as part of a cultural tour in the United States, and depicts that in Mama Rosa, to the end of her days, she thought she was the one who had opened the path for all of Otavalans. She felt empowered by that. But it was a path-breaking event for Otavalan entry into transnational travel and participation in global networks. Now, in the U.S., it was seen as sort of exoticism, novelty, but when Mama Rosa talks about it, she sees it as building transnational networks and very empowering. So I thought that was an interesting contrast as well. These initial sites generated opportunities for formal invitations and then increasingly for informal venues like sidewalk artists, musicians at fairs, things like this. Otavalans also took advantage of a 2001 one-time limited amnesty law that provided legal status to those who married a U.S. citizen prior to April 30th of that year. So we see some of the configuration of those areas. Now, until 1999, there was no visa that was required for Spain. And that became the next big destination once the United States started to impose stricter migration laws. In Spain, Otavalans operate among a large Ecuadorian migrant community and in the framework of a former colonial power. It's also a site that involves bilateral country agreements with Ecuador regarding migration policies and protections of migrant rights. Within Europe, for destinations like Switzerland, evangelical churches have played a key role in facilitating Otavalan travel, especially from the areas of San Pedro. This is products, Italy has influenced craft design. Also, Otavalan fashion trends and architectural aesthetics in Otavalan. Otavalan diaspora communities in Italy provide insights into these influences and to the changing status symbols among Otavalans modeled on European aesthetics and values. The European Union's increasingly open borders have led to Otavalan seasonal migration within Europe. Within Latin America, Chile, for example, offers an example of a relatively accessible market outlet for traditional Otavalan products. The shared cultural traits, such as the common language and familiarity with Indian music and culture, to some extent facilitate an initial entry for migrants both into the country and into the transnational networking path as sort of like a stepping stone. And Chile extends opportunities for secondary and college education with scholarship opportunities for young indigenous migrants. And so it's become a destination that attracts entire family migration for settled periods of time. For instance, I have a godson who moved there at the age of 13. He is now in college and has a family of his own with an Otavalan woman. And they're staying there and they have a child. So it's become increasingly attractive for that sense. In Colombia, we find Otavalan communities with their own cabildo or town council. And Chile and Colombia are often entry points into a broader network of transnational migration. We see Otavalans forging new paths in Australia. Otavalans participated as spectators at the FIFA World Cup in South Africa in 2010. And Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, and especially China are sites of growing Otavalan migration, and they're also countries that have a growing ethnic presence in Ecuador and in Otavalo itself. There are Otavalans attending universities in Finland, the United States, Russia, Cuba for medical schools, Mexico, lots of technical institutes that have established enduring ties to those countries and have also cultivated networks with other international students from various parts of the world. Scholarships in those countries enable the flow of indigenous professionals back to Ecuador and in many ways prepared a generation of indigenous political leaders and activists. So that brief overview, just a kind of a collage, just underscores Calderon's call for this theory of migration that is attentive to the politics and poetics of destination and the increasing heterogeneity of experiences to which it points. This corrective seems particularly timely and necessary in regards to increasingly settled, less jet-setting Otavalan diaspora communities and the unique identities to which they give rise, especially among foreign-born and foreign-raised generations within the diaspora. This general impression of the diversity of Otavalan migration experience also hints at methodological and theoretical challenges and opportunities, insights of multi-sided transnational ethnography. So let me go to a specific example and see, still have a little bit of time now. The specific example that I want to look at is Japan. So Japan represents a contrasting ethnographic site and a travel destination for Otavalans that is different than this in many respects. Language and cultural differences are among the most obvious. Japan raises unique cultural challenges for migrants, but also potential advantages in a society with conceptions of ethnicity, indigenous otherness, and musical aesthetics that are different from those of the West, and in many ways untethered by shared colonial, post-colonial, and neo-colonial histories. Cities like Nagoya and Kitakyushu have become important destinations for Otavalan musicians who receive formal invitations to perform at concert halls for huge fan bases. And this experience contrasts sharply with that of Otavalan musicians in Latin America, Europe, and North America, who often play for tips on sidewalks or crafts fairs and festivals. And as such, Japan represents a different type of status for Otavalan migrants and musicians. Performance and representation are central to indigenous identities. Performance and representation of indigenous identities are central to Otavalan transnational excursions, both in Japan and elsewhere. And they call forth this literature on representation that invites us into a realm that is interpretive, and that some of the things that I use here would be the use of strategic essentialisms and anti-essentialisms, transcultural misrepresentations, and representational excess, and the ways by which Otavalans intervene in representations of indigeneity already in circulation. It also invites us into the realm of semiotic analysis that goes beyond the symbolic, language-based, social conventional understandings because of the cultural contrast that we see in Japan. So this in the context of this cultural and linguistic difference in terms of trying to figure out or look at ways that bridge those differences. In the context of transnational musical scenes, musicians navigate both real and perceived differences and affinities across a range of sensitivities, including symbolic awareness and discourse, but also micro-level aesthetics and gestures, nonverbal cues, the syntax and semantics of self-representation. All groups negotiate to a greater or lesser extent and with varying degrees of success. The politics of performance, authenticity, representation, and cross-cultural communication. My analysis of one group's careful orchestration of their musical performance and representations abroad revealed how keenly aware the musicians of this group, the group is Seaside, how keenly aware the musicians are of subtle likenesses and contrasts vis-a-vis foreign audiences, and how the group strategically operates within these spaces of aesthetic detail, musical nuance, discursive registers, and cultural gradation to create possibilities for bridging cultural difference. The performance that they do in Japan raises questions about the reflexive processes and exchanges that take place within transnational musical scenes more broadly. So for instance, in their performances, Seaside introduces a foreign audience to essential elements of Otavalan culture and indigenous performance aesthetics, and that requires a significant amount of self-reflection about what those may be, right? It brings indigenous cosmovision center stage. They also deliberately confront stereotypes and strategically redefine images of indigenous people in ways that resist essentialisms. They establish musical footholds for cross-cultural recognition at the level of musical aesthetics and performance style, creating spaces for generating the conditions for cultural understanding, whereas Paul Carter writes the desire for communication across cultural understanding. And finally, they involve the audience as participants in the musical experience, which is really attuned to Andean conceptions of musical participation. So how do they do this? And this is where I think that this type of multi-sided analysis generates some interesting methodological and theoretical approaches for me. So Seaside introduces, like in their introduction, they depict a very traditional ritual, the tinkui, the battle, in the Andes, and traditional festival characters, the ayaumas. These are really at the core of a lot of the festivals that we see in the Andes. And immediately after that introduction, they transition into a stylized sound played on a combination of electric, Andean, and non-traditional instruments. They introduce a song that's called Un hasta pronto, but it involves the electric guitar. And as they segue into this song, the stage brightens, spotlighting the musicians who project a complex image of indigenous identity. While some members of Seaside wear the white pants and wool fedora hats characteristic of traditional Otavalan male attire, others don clothes and haircuts that reflect an adoption of certain aspects of Japanese fashion. Native American accessories also appear, including earrings, necklaces, or chokers, hair tassels. These are all conspicuous, and this is interesting to me because it's become increasingly popular among Otavalan youths who wear these items as souvenirs from travels to the United States, but also contemporary indigenous fashion statements, cultural appropriations, recast as part of Otavalan identity. So for example, the dream catchers in the Otavalo area are known as el pasaporte otavaleño, right? Like any car that has a dream catcher, you can automatically identify it as Otavalan, And of course, the dream catchers are produced locally. So, in some cases, it may be a symbol of pan-indigenous affirmations, but I think that this idea of Native American paraphernalia as a symbol of transnational indigeneity is pretty prevalent. It constitutes something potentially like a strategic anti-essentialism, where performing an identity that's not entirely one's own implies a reflexive process that eventually brings one back to one's own identity. That's just a shot. I'm not sure. I'll stand by that later on, but don't quote me. Now, it's really interesting to note that in a different context, Seaside performs a salsa repertoire, complete with the outfits that represent a more transnational Latin American identity. These conscious redefinitions of indigenous images abroad are fluid, context-based, and multifaceted. They invite us to engage indigenous self-conceptions and representations in terms of spectrums of identity, rather than fixed or singular identities. The juxtaposition of traditional aspects of Otavalan culture and non-traditional elements of Otavalan experience disrupt existing frames of reference about Andean identities, confounding potential stereotypes of indigenous others. Writing about musical contrasts and temporal silences as meaningful elements in the poetics of music, Thomas Clifton suggests that such juxtapositions can provoke a momentary shift in awareness. And what I'm referring to here is a transition between this traditional ritual that sort of fades with traditional instruments and then enter the electric guitar. And so Clifton sort of explores these spaces of transition, and says that they cause this momentary shift in awareness. So musical transitions carry an element of surprise that by their very nature suddenly strengthen the self-consciousness and generate an opportunity to grasp the rhythm of the movement from a different perspective. Take people out of it. By operating effectively within these microspaces of temporal intervals and transitions, Seaside musicians render these brief musical changeovers occasions to insert their own cultural understandings and self-representations in creative, but also positioned cross-cultural dialogue. I'll skip over this more analysis on Clifton, but just to mention that OSU has a cognitive ethnomusicology lab, and people working specifically on this type of micro-analysis at a musical level linked to cognitive psychology. So it's pretty exciting and an opportunity for interdisciplinary collaborations at some point, hopefully. In transnational context, Seaside guides the audience through the spaces of ambiguity and possibility toward a disposition of openness by highlighting similarities and narrowing distance between real or perceived differences. So we hear how the group plays on recognizably shared musical and cultural aesthetics that evoke what George Lipsitz calls the aesthetic families of resemblance. By doing this, Seaside exposes the ways by which music enables unique processes of cultural approximation that gradually break down us, not us, cultural binaries, and eventual distinctions between performers and audience, in fact, replacing these arbitrary divisions with unifying metaphors of resemblance and proximity. And just very briefly, I'll kind of list some of the things that they do. For example, they use of course, the minor pentatonic scale is there, but it's shared in both cultures, and so it serves as this sort of connection to these families of resemblance that George Lipsitz talks about. The use of falsetto. So the Ioma speak in these higher tones that are, people say it's to communicate with las almas, or to disguise the voice. And it's similar to Japanese dance drama, preference for the high tones. And it also resonates with a Japanese concept of kawaii, which means everything that is cute and adorable. Pantomime, used in both cultures, and in the realm of the semiotic sort of provides a non-linguistic vocabulary that connects the audience that is mutually intelligible and imitable. Imitation is a big part of this. Language similarities. So Seaside takes advantage of the linguistic similarities, such as the use of short vowels in Spanish, Japanese, and Quechua to narrow the perception of cultural distance. Members of Seaside code switch among the three languages throughout the performance without translation, and the phonetic similarities lend themselves to creating the impression of a single undifferentiated flow of verbal expression as members of Seaside transition from one language to another without translation. And given the rich semiotic context of the layering of the musicality, the gestures, the nonverbal cues, within the performance, where language complements understanding, but it doesn't exclusively define it, the multilingual exchange is, in effect, mutually intelligent. There's one song that is highly repetitive, and we see how Seaside uses this song to create a sense of an inclusive we, right? And so in the song, they use intense repetition and gibberish. So at one point they say, churai, 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 churai. It's very pronounceable for Japanese audiences. So So even people who don't know the song chime in, you know, and they'll point the microphone, you know, to the audience, and they chime in as if they did know the song and that they own the song, right? Like there's a sense of participation. And in another part of the song, they use gibberish, right? Like la 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 la. So here they say oh no 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 no. And again, the audience, even without prompting, sort of jumps in, you know, to do this. So it creates a sense of inclusiveness. As Berger signals in a chapter on the politics and aesthetics of language choice and dialect and popular music, gibberish underscores the phatic and self-expressive in the communicative function of language, moving us away from the semantic realm of referential context of words and toward a space of cross-cultural participation through doing that is socially meaningful and at least partially constitutive of identity. So these are some examples of the ways that Seaside creates this likeness. And how these ethnic likenesses are creatively suggested and highlighted within these performance macrospaces. It also shows Seaside's versatility to navigate complex symbolic and semiotic systems between cultures. It also shows their versatility as musicians. I mean, these are cosmopolitan, top-notch, skilled musicians, you know. Beyond highlighting the cultural resemblances in their performances, however, Seaside's musical versatility, virtuosity, lays in their ability to actually create an experience of cross-cultural community, which they achieved by drawing the audience into participation in their musical performances. In one of their return trips to Otavalo, they play almost exclusively Otavalo Asia. They play a tour called Sisa Evolucion, and assuming the role of cultural ambassadors. They incorporate taiko drums and Japanese instruments, Japanese melodies, played on Andean and Japanese instruments, as they play for Otavalan audiences. And when they play their signature song, Un Hasta Pronto, my sense is that it connects Otavalo to transnational audiences, and beyond that, even for a suspended moment of desire and imagined possibility, to a global community of affect. So that's Seaside. Not all bands are like this. There's a whole range of them, and there is one in particular, La Raza, who they dress entirely in Native American headdresses, you know, Native American garb. They play cumbia, pre-recorded cumbia, and they still present themselves as Otavalan. So this might be an example of a representational excess or misrepresentation. Another example would be Leo Rojas, who is the winner of the Germany's Got Talent 2012, on the subject of strategic anti-essentialisms and misrepresentation as well. But what was interesting to me is Leo Rojas comes onto the stage for one of the final performances on a white horse with dry ice, you know, creating the effect, and a backdrop, a huge backdrop with a waterfall, you know. And he gets off his horse and he has a grain stick. He's wearing Native American paraphernalia, you know, and then he proceeds to play a tune that is not Andean on Andean instruments. You know. But he won this contest, and one of the things that was very interesting to me was that at a meeting here in Columbus of Ecuadorian migrants, they played a video of Leo Rojas, and everybody was so proud of him. So it's interesting that via this transnational sort of representation, he's been adopted now as a national symbol, you know, for migrants. So I'm gonna stop there. My conclusions, I think, sort of reiterate, you know, this productivity that I found in looking at theories of mobility and also looking at theories of the politics of destination. I mentioned in there that my relationship with these communities has changed because of their mobility, their access to technology, Facebook, MySpace, you know, like that kind of exchange, Skype. But I do want to reiterate one point, aside from just saying that this is not about just adding destinations to case studies, you know, that each destination does provide some very productive sort of insight into Otavalan mobility. It's not, it challenges a one-size-fits-all, you know, concept of of migration. But for me, the most important thing is this connection between mobility and cosmopolitanism, conceiving of a cosmopolitanism from below that potentially has implications for both national and international senses of community. Okay.